Now there's an interesting question for you. Who are we exactly to mete out judgment upon whom should live and who should die? Before I begin, I'd like to kind of go off on something. I'll go ahead and, as usual, put a little bit of a timestamp down there to say this is when the actual video begins, so watch for that down there somewhere. But can I just speak frankly to you as a, as a bit of a Star Trek fan, a Trekker, as I would call myself, can I just speak openly? One of the things I found fascinating about Star Trek in general is it is the second worst fan base I've ever encountered with regards to violently and arduously arguing about really, really minor and minute details. I've had people argue with me about whether or not you should or should not be able to beam through the shield. I've had people argue with me about whether or not Picard is actually from France. I've had people argue with me about whether or not it is considered canon to say that Starfleet ever actually militarized, or if that was a separate branch of Starfleet. And I could keep going. There's a lot of really, really little, dinky little things, because, see, here's the catch. It's a two-point thing, right? Number one, this is Star Trek. Now, Star Trek has been going for several decades now, across multiple series and multiple mediums. That means lots of different people involved in making it, lots of different people involved in perceiving it, viewing it, digesting it, etc. In other words, pretty much no matter what you do, every single individual person who considers themselves a fan or an enjoyer of Star Trek, to whatever extent, is probably going to have a different perspective on what exactly Star Trek is. I mentioned this briefly back in my Into Darkness video. Now, the other interesting thing about this is the fact that, and there's no real getting around this, Star Trek, no matter how you perceive it, is something that a lot of people found enjoyment in. Now, I've talked about this briefly before, so I'm only going to go ahead and briefly recover it. The idea here is the concept of something that we enjoy, and when something that we enjoy is attacked, or at least perceived to be attacked, or either or, we tend to get unmeasured in our response to that. We tend to react a little bit more strongly than we probably should, or actually in some cases intended to, simply because of the fact that we were so upset about them attacking something that we liked, whether because it's something we perceived as a threat to ourselves or an insult, or because we don't like the idea of trying to consider something that we enjoy so much in a negative light, or because we were so sick of some people who are so derogatory towards things we like. There's a billion reasons. My point in this, though, is that when I was making my notes for this episode, not very many notes, this is going to be kind of a short video, which is why I don't feel bad about starting with this little intro thing. When I was making my notes for this video, I made a note, and I'm just going to read it to you right now. It says, Emergency and Starfleet Military. Now, I mention that because one of the things I've seen argued more strenuously among Star Trek fans of whatever they care to call themselves is whether or not Starfleet is in fact a military. Now, obviously, based on my previous explanations and the things I've talked about, and of course my note right there, I obviously do consider Starfleet to be military, and have, all the way since the original season. Even though I fully acknowledge the fact that under several sources it could be considered that Starfleet is not a military, especially since Gene himself did not actually want Starfleet to basically be a military. I'll allow that it's up to debate. And again, like I said, because of the breadth of the work, it's one of those things where I could actually try to defend my side, quote-unquote, with actual facts from the show or books or whatever's considered canon. But I could also attack my own position with facts from the show, because Star Trek is inconsistent. That's really all there is to it. There's nothing else for it. I just wanted to talk about this right off the bat here because I find it fascinating. The only fan base I have ever seen that is actually more volatile in their emotional response, ironically, to discussions and arguments about the topic in question is anything Blizzard related, which is why I try to stay quiet about that sort of thing nowadays. But anyways, let's go ahead and get on with this. I'm going to say this right up front here, and then we'll talk about it more in detail later. This is one of those weird episodes that I really like because it is an excellent examination of a character, and it really performs well in its execution. Yeah, I know, word choice, right? That's all I'm going to say about that for now. Let's go ahead and talk about ridiculous premises. I've talked about this before, especially with regards to Voyager. I assure you, I'll be talking about this again when it comes to TNG and Deep Space Nine, because one of the things Star Trek is actually kind of good at least sometimes, is having a really stupid, ridiculous idea, and then actually doing something with it to make an entertaining hour or whatever of television, or movies, or whatever. Good example. Let me just, before I go into this, let me give you a really great example. Star Trek 4, if you bear down the plot, is about going back in time to rescue humpback whales so they can communicate somehow with this probe thing that is destroying the planet and has been wiping out everything in its way for some reason. That's the plot of Star Trek 4. Now, that being said, I and many people like myself would say Star Trek 4 is a great movie. I love that movie. I enjoyed the hell out of that movie. When I watched it with my sister again very recently, when we were going through the Star Trek movies, we both had a ball watching that movie. It's great. It's one of my favorites. But the plot is stupid. I'm sorry. It just is. Before you bring it up, yes, I've read the Probe book, which isn't considered canon, but just saying, I have read the Probe book, I have heard how they tried to justify it, and it's a good explanation, but that doesn't change the fact that the story is a ridiculous premise. Your starting point is silly, but they still did something good with it. Please understand, this is praise, because this is something, like I said, Star Trek does fairly often. And this is actually a good episode that is indicative of that. I'll go ahead and give you the premise right here. The transporters, which are working perfectly for some reason, whenever they beam up anything that happens to be with a symbiogenetic plant, they merge all the beings into one cohesive Frankenstein's monster. That's the premise. I don't even know where to begin to go how silly and stupid that sounds. And that's basically all I'm going to say about it right there. I mean, I could actually deconstruct, the science of it, but that's not what I'm here for. That's not what you're here for. All I'm trying to make the point of is on premise, if you read the plot description, you're just going to be like, huh? And you're probably going to skip this episode because that sounds ludicrous. But they do something with it. And that brings me into my next point right here. Tom Wright. Now, Tom Wright actually hasn't done a lot of Star Trek. He's worked with Tim Russ on other things. He's done one other role in Star Trek in total. That was in Enterprise as an alien Nazi. Remember what I just said about premises. Just bear with me, okay? So Tom Wright actually does a phenomenal job, and I think one of the big reasons why is because he really put a lot of his own effort and heart into the role. One of the things I've said often is that when you care about doing well at something, you tend to do better at it than someone who's just doing it for a job, right? And virtually all of the behind-the-scenes info I found about this episode was from Tom Wright's perspective. Lots of people interviewing him, or his notes on it within the canon or within the behind-the-scenes stories, that kind of a thing. He wrote that this was a unique and fascinating experience for him to do, and he believed that this was the type of character that virtually no one else had actually had a chance to play within the history of Star Trek. And I'm not sure if that's 100% true. Maybe there's a character somewhere that disproves that, but I got to kind of agree on the overall sense, because the idea is he has to play someone who is logical, who is calculating and intelligent, but he has to play that person with a great deal of warmth and friendship in their air and atmosphere. He has to avoid becoming arrogant. He has to avoid being overbearing. He has to avoid being extroverted. He has to avoid all the pitfalls that mark the quote-unquote negative aspects of both Tuvix and Neelix to get across this role. And I think that's pretty much the reason why this episode succeeds in my mind. His performance is pretty much spot on. I'd give him a 9 out of 10 easily, and I'd probably raise it if I actually stopped to think about it even more. He does a great job of Tuvix. There's a couple scenes that are a little bit awkward, but every single one of them was awkward in character, if you know what I mean. It wasn't the actor not sure what to do with his role. It was the character not sure what to do with his role in existence, with his personality, with his position, with the problems facing him. Now, that's a good thing, the whole the usage of Tom Wright as this actor, because there's almost no notes about the actual creative staff working on this episode, which is funny because the writing's crap. Forgive me for being blunt, but it is. If you actually took out... One of the things that I've often said to do, it's actually three things, but I'll tell you the one right now. In order to digest, in order to analyze writing, remove whoever's saying the lines, remove their performance, and just read them flat, preferably out loud, because lines always read differently in our heads and when they're spoken out loud, which is one of those weird little nicks. But anyways, bear with me. So if you read the lines of this episode out loud, especially Tuvix's, they're actually pretty bad, all things considered. And it just kind of comes across as stilted and forced. There's too many times where he constantly has to emphasize something that really didn't need to be emphasized with his dialogue. And if it wasn't for Tom Wright's performance, I probably would rate this episode far worse than I actually do. That being said, one thing they do incredibly well in this episode, and this is absolutely critical, they make it abundantly clear that Tuvix is a unique individual. That Tuvix is a person. Now, I know you're probably looking at me like, huh, what do you mean? But it would have been so easy, and indeed Star Trek has actually done this concept before, to treat Tuvix as a transporter accident. To treat him as just something that needs to be fixed. And indeed, they even mention this within the episode, the idea that, at some point in time, they started to become friends with this new entity who has access to all the memories of the previous two, but is, for all intents and purposes, a completely brand new individual. And indeed, he himself acts differently from the beginning, where he's all about trying to fix this thing and encouraging them to find something, towards the end, when he has embraced his own life and wants to hold on to it. So, definitely a good plus. It would have been too easy to cop out on that. This episode actually is... Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. Before you think I'm saying that Star Trek has never done this, though, it's worth noting that one of the other examples of this, I forget the episode name, forgive me, it was The Next Generation, where they encounter Thomas Riker. And if you know Star Trek at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about already. For those of you who don't, William Riker was beamed away, but he also wasn't. Now, the interesting thing here is that this literally cloned him pretty much exactly at the time, and the two Rikers then proceeded to live their own lives. And as you might imagine, the two Rikers had very different personalities because they had so much time apart, they had become more individual from the original. Which makes sense to me, I might add. And again, this episode takes that same premise and does something with it. Not the duplication thing, but the idea that the more time you spend in this new state, on this new status, the more different you become from the originals. Tuvix actually is pretty distinct by the end from Tuvok and Neelix. And I think that's really well done. Now, I said I wouldn't talk about it, but I gotta mention this. There's a point in this episode where Tuvix just randomly says, sex. Right in the middle of the thing. Let's make this absolutely clear, okay? When you do something like that in a show or a movie or whatever, you are doing it for the impact value. Whether you're actually trying to shock or whether you're trying to get attention or whatever, you do that deliberately to draw focus. It's kind of juvenile, especially if you're not really going anywhere with it, and it felt like kind of an awkward attempt at humor that maybe some people find it amusing. I don't know anybody personally. I'm not going to rule it out. I just found it awkward and irritating, and every time I see that scene, I just kind of groan a little bit. It's like, okay, come on, get on with it. Because the thing is, that doesn't even really accurately lead into what he's talking about when he starts talking about symbiogenesis, where he explains his theory about how he came to be, which is ridiculous, and I said I wouldn't get into it. There's another note here about it, but I'm going to ignore it. I said I wouldn't. Let's go ahead and talk about the other thing this episode does really poorly, and that is the fact that the kitchen goes into total chaos without Neelix there. There's a whole scene where Tuvix is going down to cook dinner or breakfast or lunch or whatever for Kiss. I think it was actually breakfast because they have crepes with mushrooms. Why would you have mushrooms with crepes? God, Crepes are a fruit dish. Come on. So they go down there, and the kitchen is in chaos. And there's like, I don't know, 12 different crewmen running around trying to make heads or tails of the kitchen, trying to cook lunch, I believe is actually he specifically said. And Tuvix is like, get out, get out. He actually has a really good line, in all honesty, where he's like, get everyone out now. On whose authority? Chief of Security or Chief Morale Officer? Take your pick. Now go. It was actually a good line. And it was well delivered, actually, is really what it was. He does it with a genuine. You can tell that he's mostly kidding, but it's a lighthearted moment. But he's still just like, oh my god, come on, one of those sort of things. So that actually succeeded. The reason I count this as a negative is because this would be far more effective if they were doing with Neelix what I would be doing with Neelix, and actually making him a vital, useful, awesome character member of the crew, rather than an irritant that is constantly being made fun of in a half-assed attempt in order to make comedy happen. How many times now have I, on this show that you're watching right now, said, oh my god, Neelix is bad at cooking, isn't that funny? Seriously. It would have made much more sense if they hadn't been taking that retarded look at Neelix, and instead had actually made him out to be a good cook, to be someone who is helping them stretch out their food stores and their energy stores, and being a valued member of the thing, so that when we see this scene, it would have hammered the point in perfectly. It would have smashed it right in and say, yep, Neelix is incredibly valuable, and holy crap, everything's going to hell without him, because, let's face it, this is Starfleet. These people didn't know what a splint was back in Next Generation. Yes, I remember. I haven't forgotten. I wonder how many people out there watching this catch that reference. I always wonder that. I always wonder how many people catch the casual Star Trek references I toss out there. Yeah. I kind of want to talk about that last. We're actually going to skip ahead a bit here in my notes. Right? Wait, hang on. Oh, yep, that's not my note. I've got notes that are sideways and notes that are right, so bear with me here. So, there's a montage that happens after a couple of awesome scenes I'll be talking about at the end. And this montage does something really good, all things considered. It has Janeway talking about how they've grown to accept and admit Tuvix into their quote-unquote family. I've talked about this idea before, the fact that Voyager should be a family of some sort. I hate myself for saying that, but I do believe that firmly. I could point to the families that exist on the other Trek shows, namely all of them except for Enterprise, basically. But I've mentioned before the incredible chemistry between the actors and the actors in most of the directors on Voyager. And the interaction between them creates that general air of warmth and friendship that really works well, I think, for that whole family thing. And of course, forgive me for pointing this out, but they're in the frickin' Delta Quadrant. I know, right? It doesn't seem like it, but bear with me, they are. And that alone means that these people should be more tight than they sometimes feel. But I mention this because this scene actually emphasizes that family nature of the crew overall pretty well. By showing the inclusion of a new member into it, we get a more insight into the unit itself. Make sense? And again, props to them for treating Tuvix as an individual rather than, well, than a Frankenstein's monster. So that montage was pretty good. It also shows something I find interesting. One of the things that has been argued a billion times and has not been settled even now to this date is the idea of nurture versus nature. For those of you not familiar with it, I'm going to cover it very briefly. The idea is, are we innately A, or can we only become A through experience and through examination, through memories, through incidents, through things that happen in our lives? That's basically what it comes down to. Now, if you ask me personally, I'd say it's actually kind of a mixed thing to do because it's me. But the point is, we see in Tuvix someone who has all the memories, all the knowledge, all the expertise of Tuvok and Neelix. And yet now he has experiences to do something with those. And so we see him not only existing in this way because of his nature, but he grows and becomes better at cooking and at security because of his nurture, because of the way he is existing, because of his experience, because of the things he's going through. Again, props to Tom Wright. It really helps flesh out Tuvix as a person we sympathize with, as a person we care about. And I just want to mention one other thing, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's true. One of the things I like about Tuvix is the fact that he's kind of hideous. I know what you're saying, but I genuinely like that. I like the fact that he is this weird amalgam creature. They did a whole new makeup job on him, and actually put a great deal of effort went into the makeup and styling of Tuvix in general. A lot of little touches about the ears, the ridges, the way his hair worked, all that little thing. It was all based off of both, obviously, but they really wanted to get across the idea that this was a completely unique being, and he looks kind of horrible as a result of it, especially those creepy eyes. I wanted to say what they actually are, but I can't think of it. Things you put in your eyes. I can't think what they're called all of a sudden. Regardless, it's also worth noting, if you watch this episode, you can kind of notice it. The gentleman, Tom Wright, who was playing it, was basically blind when he had those things you put in your eyes, in his eyes. So he was basically, I'm actually pretty blind without my glasses, but imagine this, but with like a filter over it. So this is how he's going around performing his scene, and you can kind of get that idea across. But at the same time, he does such a wonderful job of it that I almost don't notice. I was only paying attention really carefully to see if I could tell, only because of the fact that he pointed it out in his interview. Otherwise, I would have just been completely taken in by his performance. My point is, though, too often Star Trek will take someone... hell, let's not blame Star Trek. Too often fiction, of all forms, will take someone who's different and trying to flesh them out as a human character, and they're basically human. Now, you could argue that Tuvix is basically human because he's humanoid, and I'm not going to argue that. My point is, it's refreshing to see someone who is genuinely just kind of horrifying and creepy looking be fleshed out as a human being, if you know what I mean by that, or as a sentient being, if you prefer not to be speciesist about it. And I like that. Let's go ahead and talk about the quote-unquote moral dilemma. It's pretty obvious if, again, you read the words, if you read the dialogue of this episode without the performance in it. But the intended point of this episode was to breeze up the moral dilemma. Now, this is a weird moral dilemma, but I'll give it props for being innovative, because it's kind of unique. Do you kill a brand new being in order to reintroduce the two previous beings that made up that being into existence? I actually myself have used this concept within a story I called Extant, which I'm actually still in the process of writing. Although, in that case, the idea was very strongly not to destroy the new being, because no matter how you look at it, that is still murder. That is still killing, especially if the person does not wish to give up their life for that purpose, if you see what I mean by that. But it's just a unique concept. It's a unique take on it that isn't really applicable in real life, but I like that too, because this is science fiction, after all. This is something that should be new, unique, interesting, ideal, whatever. And that being said, the moral dilemma falls flat on its face other than its concept, which is ironic, because that's like the exact opposite of the premise of the show, which is falling flat on its face and then getting up and running a marathon. The moral dilemma is like, all right, I'm ready. It ran the marathon and then it 3 feet from the end. No, seriously though, the problem here, and I think it's really obvious upon repeat viewing, and for everybody who's curious, I actually watch all the interviews that I can find, and I read some of my old magazines, and everything I've got, all the material I have available for me on Star Trek and all these episodes prior to watching it, so I have an idea of what to look for and what to see, and kind of have my analytical brain turned on, if you know what I mean. And so, no, not like that. And so, as I was going through, it became really obvious, because virtually everyone involved, especially Tom Wright himself, said, there's no moral dilemma. There is no big crisis of choice in this episode. All there is the path and arc of one individual from the beginning of his life to his end. Forgive me for paraphrasing. And I kind of agree with that. But my point is, if you watch the episode, the cast also doesn't treat it like a moral dilemma. Not really. Now, they do use this dilemma as an excellent example of character growth, and I'll talk about that last, like I mentioned. But, well, second to last, actually, because the last thing I want to talk about is very at the end here. Anyways, nevertheless, my point is, it feels like the inclusion of the dilemma itself is probably one of the biggest failing points of the episode. I'll go ahead and skip ahead here, just for a little bit. See, there's a scene right at the end, where Janeway murders, whatever you want to call it, executes, is that a good word? One of her crew members in order to bring back two of her crew members. Now, the weird thing here is that that is the kind of decision a captain should be able to make. And I know that sounds weird coming from me, especially given the tonality I've been using to describe the murder up until this point. Anyone remember back in TNG when Troy Troy, of all people, was going through commander training to get her third pip, and she had to order Geordi, a holographic Geordi, but still, to his death in order to accomplish this mission, in order to save the ship. Because that's part of what being a commander means. Deciding who lives and who dies. Just like was said way back in, debatably, the first episode of Star Trek ever. The first Star Trek ever. I'm tired of deciding who lives and who dies. That's kind of a captain's job. And I know that sounds weird, but that's kind of why I think this isn't really a dilemma. This is more an examination of Janeway's character and Kess's character. I'll talk about Kess in a moment, because she is really the star of this show. I want to talk about, that's the second to last thing I want to talk about. I keep building up to it. But Janeway takes upon herself this weight, this decision. I am going to decide, force a decision. And at no point does Mulgrew treat this as something that is good. And I like that. Mulgrew does what the script does not. She gives weight and strength behind this decision. She is making an executive, pun intended, order. She is deciding to kill one of her crew members to save two of her crew members. That is her command decision. She has deliberated on it. She has debated on it. She has considered it. She is not happy with it. But she does it. I mention this because this is another example of Kate Mulgrew actually having some creative influence over her character. She insisted, strongly I might add, that she should have that kind of command attitude towards this decision. The original script apparently called for her actually having a whole other scene in which she was, for lack of a better term, blubbering. That's her words, not mine. But that she was blubbering over this, and she was just, oh my god, it was terrible. They were treating me like... her words, not mine. They were treating me like I was a woman, not a captain. And she put her foot down and said, no, I'm the captain of, Janeway is the captain of this ship. This should be her reaction. I've always liked shows, forgive me for segueing for just a moment. I've always liked shows that give actors some creative control or some creative influence on their character. Because I'm always an actor playing the role generally has a pretty good finger to the pulse of their character. Not always, of course, but especially after you've played it for a while. Stargate SG-1 is actually a great example of a show where creative control was given over to several of the actors, and they did something really good with it, so, props to that. But this is another good example of that coming out well, I think, is that Kate Mulgrew insisting that, no. We have to take this from a completely different tact. And again, she didn't think there was any moral dilemma. Not really. She thought this was a bad situation. Now, you could argue that that is a moral dilemma, admitted, but that wasn't the emphasis. The emphasis was on what exactly our characters are going to do with this bad situation. There's no win-win here. There is no way out of this. You've got bad and you've got worse. Pick one. What do you do about it, though? How do you deal with it? That's what the actors felt like focusing on. And that brings me to two last points. One, there's a scene where Janeway is talking with Kess, and she opens up to Kess, and therefore to the audience, basically for the first time, really. I've actually mentioned, as we've been going through the series, brief points. There's usually like one scene where Mulgrew would bother to go ahead and just kind of in some way show how much she is feeling the loss of Mark back on Earth, or wherever heck he lives, back in the Alpha Quadrant, in other words. But this is the first time she really sits down and talks about him. And Mulgrew's performance is perfect. She is open, and yet she is on the verge of tears, and trying very hard to hide it, and trying very hard to be comforting to someone who she knows is now going through she has been going through for the last year plus. Her commentary about how, she'll occasionally dream about him, and then she'll wake up and realize just how far he is, and sometimes she can't even understand, she can't even comprehend how far away he is, and there might come a point at which she will no longer be a part of his life, or he hers. Oh, it was wonderful. It was an amazing scene. Very, very human. And very Catherine Janeway as she should have been. And indeed, let's be honest, was on many occasions. So, definite props to that. But that brings me to my almost final point that I really want to talk about, and that is Kess. Like I said, This episode really is an excellent examination of Kess's character, probably the first beginning of the what will be, for all intents and purposes, the full totality of her character arc. Kess, up to this point, has been pretty well presented, very well acted, and basically used as a goblin utility knife. A catch-all. She does a little bit of this, a little bit of that. She kind of fills holes where needed in the plots and the episodes without really a lot of examination on her character. But this is the first episode, in my opinion, where they really start to examine Kess as a character, because Kess is someone who has been naive, innocent, warm, giving, loving, generally a very good person. Up until now, she has never faced a situation where she could not pull, as I like to call it, a Mario, where there was not some idealism or optimism or hope or something she could pull positive out of a situation. This is the first time Kess was ever shown how bad life can be in a very personal way. Because the thing that's awesome about this episode is not the fact that she desperately wants Neelix back. It's the fact that she feels guilty for wanting Neelix back, because she knows what that means. Because she does care about Tuvix, and she does actually want to be Tuvix's friend. But the moment she realizes that Neelix might be able to re-enter her life, she is destroyed emotionally. She has no idea how to deal with that. Not the wanting Neelix back, but her own terrible guilt at that feeling. And I want to re-stress that, because it's the second layer that's the most important here. And she does a wonderful job of performing this. She is so destroyed, so tormented over how she feels, because she can't deny the truth of her own feelings. She is not experienced enough with self-denial, like most of us humans are, in order to hide her own feelings or try to cover them or mask them, as I've talked about in many, many other works. No. She is just openly, I want Neelix back, and that's terrible! Because she knows the cost of that. But she can't deny it. But she knows what it would take, and she just loops, and she loops, and she loops, and at the end of the episode, she embraces Neelix so tightly. Watch the episode where she grips him, because you can tell, in her mind, it is now over. But forgive me for quoting Tuvix, and I kind of wish they'd done something with this. She now has to live with that. And that's why this is the beginning of her character arc, because Kess will start changing, pretty much over through most of Season 3. And I'll be talking about that more as we go through it. Now, second to last thing to talk about. Fifth to last? I don't know. Eighth to last? Whatever. I want to give definite props to the Doctor for existing. But no, seriously, at the end of the episode, he says, in a very, very calm and almost cold way, he says, I refuse to do this performance. I refuse to execute. It is against everything that I believe in. It's against my coding. It's against my programming. I am not executing one of my patients. And that's when Janeway basically has to do it herself. Not only is that an excellent scene because it's very much the Doctor, and as I've mentioned before, the Doctor himself is, at his first and foremost, a healer. He is a doctor. I know that sounds obvious, but it's something that's easy to forget in his character because he's got so many other dimensions to him, but it all fades away when it comes down to that basic point. He is a doctor, first and foremost, and I liked that. I also like that it forces Janeway to literally, well, as literally as it's possible in this case, bloody her hands. Again, force the decision, force the impact, force Janeway to actually undertake this terrible deed that she knows is terrible, and as she walks away with the weight of it on herself, you can just see it. Now, I'm going to just read my note here, pretty much word for word, forgive me. Sometimes an episode is memorable for one scene. There are a lot of episodes kind of like that in TNG and DS9, original series, in Voyager, even in Enterprise. Whether the scene is good or bad is a little bit more debatable or specific to the episode, but oftentimes when we think about an episode, we tend to think of a scene. I've actually talked about this before, alliances. As I was going through that episode, I was like, well, this isn't nearly as bad as I remember. And then I saw the scene, and that just... and that's the scene I remember when I think of alliances. Now, Threshold is just for 45 minutes, so that's a little bit different, but you get the point. It applies to good things, too. The Thaw. What's the scene I remember most from Thaw? I'm afraid. You know? In this episode, there is a scene where Tuvix is on the bridge and he is literally breaking down. He is so afraid. And my heart goes out to him because even though he's a fictional character, because I know that kind of fear, he runs around desperate, unable to comprehend that these people, his friends, people he relied on and trusted and bonded with, he, Tuvix, not the original beings, that they are so willing to let him be destroyed. And as he pleads and begs for his life, and he tries to run, but not really, he doesn't actually run. He knows there's nowhere to go. He is literally just reacting because he has lost all hope. And the terrible horror of that scene as he accepts death and forgives those crewmates for the fact that they are murdering him in his eyes. That scene is what I remember when I think of Tuvix, and one of the reasons why I usually write it pretty high in my overall list, because that scene is wonderful. Now, despite the overall praise I have for this episode, I do have some changes here. I know we haven't really done a lot of changes lately, forgive me. I also know that, per your guys' request, I abandoned the Imperium storyline for Voyager and just kind of started doing the, page one rewrite thing. But I'm throwing that out the window right now, because I can't actually change this episode within the confines of one episode. I would want to drag this out. I have several ideas for to do this. Now, first and foremost, I tend to be the kind of guy who likes making long changes in my story. It's just something I feel adds a bit more impact to it. Part of that really comes from alive during the generation when Superman died and then came back. And as we've talked about before, that just destroys any dramatic potential of the situation. Superman dying and not coming back, that would have been something we'd still be talking about today in a more positive light, as opposed to Superman dying and then coming back, which we are still talking about today in a slightly more negative light. Point being, I would have not had the end of the episode hit the reset button. In all honesty, I would have, if I had total control, I would pull the rug right from under the viewers. Right at the end, Janeway makes the decision, makes the call, makes the command decision, does the process, doesn't work. And Tuvix is sitting there, and he's in shock, and Janeway's like, what? And then they analyze it, and, technobabble wrong, or whatever. The reason why it doesn't work doesn't actually matter. The point is it doesn't work. And the episode ends on their realization that Tuvix is now something they're going to have to continue to live with. And Tuvix's knowledge that these people were so willing to let him die. And then Tom Wright would remain a guest star for several episodes, at least 2. I prefer more, but I understand the limitations of production. So at least 2 more episodes where he actually plays Tuvix as a character in this thing. And over those episodes, a B-plot would constantly under an undercurrent for whatever going on. He is basically kind of mentally bring down a bit. He comes to grips with his own fear, with his own desire to live, and his own for the fact that he had chosen his life over theirs. Even though the procedure didn't work, even though he relented in the end, he did so unwillingly. And so I would have examined his character arc that way. I would have had him descend first and, kind of lose it a bit, probably get removed from the bridge, removed from active duty, and that would be perfect timing because then we would come up to basics, and we all know what happened in basics. I wouldn't even have to change that. Imagine if Tuvix was one of the people who was left behind on Voyager to work with Suitor. I had to think about that for a moment. To work with Suitor and the Doctor. And you probably already see where I'm going with that. Yes, I would actually have Tuvix be the one who actually makes that final decision, and have maybe the Doctor have the capacity to bring just one of the people. This is the thing I do. I get several episodes now. Definitely in series, have the idea coming that Tuvix can be reconstituted into one of his original beings, but not both. And as they're trying to how to do that, one of the things they come up with as an idea is to go ahead and bring back the other in a more limited format. I know this is kind of a weird idea, but I like this, especially because it has so much potential. So I'm just going to toss this out there. This is the kind of thing I'd want feedback on from people, because I don't like making sweeping changes like this by myself. It's not my writing style. But I would like the idea of Tuvix being reconstituted back into Tuvok willingly, thanks to his character arc he's been having over the last several episodes, and Neelix being basically downloaded into the computer to exist as a hologram, similar to the way the Doctor does. Two of the things I like about that right off the bat is, first of all, it maintains the main characters of the cast, which I know is some kind of a big deal, especially then, when changing members like The Walking Dead does all the time, Battlestar Galactica or Game of Thrones, wasn't really something to do. So, okay, you've maintained cast. Tim Russ comes back, Ethan Phillips comes back, we're good. It makes it so that Tuvok now has to live with not only his experiences as Tuvix, because he would remember them all, but Tuvok would then also... It would be the beginning of another character arc for Tuvok, is basically where I'm going with that. And there's other things I could do with that. I don't want to bore you with those. But, of course, this would also be the beginning of a character arc for Neelix, and the beginning of the idea of placing holographic emitters on other parts of the ship, which, of course, would culminate in... Future's End, I believe, is the name of this series, the two-parter, where the emitter was added into the show. You get where I'm going at, though. Neelix suddenly being confined to the holodeck, or in the sick bay, or mess hall, which happens to be one of the other places that they actually have holographic emitters, would be something you could do something with. Imagine a man like that, who, at least the way I portray, is someone who is very adventurous, enthusiastic, explorative, Han Solo-ish, you know? Someone who is now confined to 3 rooms. Everywhere, anywhere. 3 rooms, that's all he's got. Imagine as Tuvok is struggling with his own guilt and his problems, Neelix is now being deconstructed from the things he's gone through. I would love for at some point in time someone to say, as these two characters are basically having their lives kind of slowly shredded by their return to existence, maybe we did the wrong thing in bringing them back. I'm not sure we did them a favor, you know? And really examine that. Anyways, that's just... There's more you could do with that long term. I don't want to get too far out of the episode. That's basically the only thing that really change when it comes down to it, is build the more long-term potential. You have this great actor doing this great role with great potential. Do something with it. Now, you already did. Props for props are due. Keep going. Don't just stop there. You don't run a marathon for like 1 lap and then stop. Yep, good, I'm out. Peace! At least that's my opinion on the matter.